Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. European leaders are set to join Vladimir Zelensky in his much-anticipated meeting with US President Donald Trump. They are seeking to shore up the Ukrainian president's position as his US counterpart presses Kyiv to accept a quick peace deal to end Europe's deadliest war in 80 years. President Donald Trump says Ukraine's leader can end the war with Russia almost immediately, but rules out retaking Crimea or joining NATO. Ukraine's President Zelensky, meanwhile, hails US security guarantees and calls for stronger protection with Europe's participation. Meanwhile, Russia fires a ballistic missile into a residential area of Kharkiv, injuring at least 11 people, including a 13-year-old girl. The blast shatters windows, damages apartments and forces evacuations as rescuers aid residents. Thousands join protests demanding a deal with Hamas to free hostages and end the war, blocking roads between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in Israel. Police detained 38 demonstrators and Netanyahu warned such calls harden Hamas's position. Early results show centrist Senator Rodrigo Paz leading Bolivia's presidential race with around 32% of the vote, followed by conservative former President Jorge Tuto Quadriga with 27%. The two now head off for a runoff, ending 2 decades of leftist rule. Air Canada cancels more flights as a strike by flight attendants shuts down operations and strands passengers worldwide. The airline said it will resume limited flights tomorrow evening after a union decision to extend the walkout. Scorching heat fans 20 major wildfires across Spain, forcing road and rail closures in Galicia as several blazes merge into one. The government deploys more than 500 more troops to support what is now one of Europe's worst fire seasons in decades. A Hong Kong court reconvenes for closing arguments in the national security trial of 77-year-old media tycoon Jimmy Lai. The pro-democracy Apple Daily founder, accused of colluding with foreign forces, faces life in prison if convicted. For our top story today, we head to the United States, where Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in Washington, D.C. ahead of high-level meetings with President Donald Trump and European leaders. Zelensky said he hopes our shared strength with America and European friends will compel Russia to real peace. That's what he said. He also thanked President Donald Trump for the invitation and emphasized the need to end the war swiftly and securely. President Trump says he is committed to supporting Ukraine and highlighted the importance of working with European partners to maintain pressure on Russia. Meanwhile, Steve Witkoff said the US and Europe could offer Article 5-like security guarantees for Ukraine outside NATO. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned of potentially new sanctions if a peace deal is not reached. Let's listen in to what Rubio had to say.
Well, first of all, the Russians are already facing very severe consequences. There's not a single sanction that's been lifted, and not one. I mean, they're facing all the same sanctions that have been in place today. All the American support continues for Ukraine. And ultimately, look, if we're not going to be able to reach an agreement here at any point, then there are going to be consequences. Not only the consequences of the war continuing, but the consequences of all those sanctions continuing and potentially new sanctions on top of it as well. But what we're trying to do right now is end the war. And in order to end a war, you've got to give every opportunity that exists. You have to be open to any opportunity that exists to bring it about.
Meanwhile, French President Macron says he wants to present a united front with Ukraine in Washington, warning Russia's peace offer would be a capitulation. He believes Putin does not seek true peace. Listen in to what the French president had to say.
Au fond, notre volonté demain, c'est de présenter un front uni entre Européens et Ukrainiens dans ce moment de règlement du conflit, en réaffirmant qui est du côté de la paix, qui est du côté du droit international, mais surtout comment nous assurer collectivement que l'ordre international est respecté et que notre sécurité à tous est protégée. Parce qu'il en va de la sécurité des Européens et de la France. Pouvoir ici rappeler qu'il ne peut pas y avoir de discussion territoriale concernant l'Ukraine sans les responsables légitimes, démocratiquement élus de l'Ukraine. Pas de discussion sur l'Ukraine sans les Ukrainiens. Mais de la même manière, pas de discussion sur la sécurité des Européens sans eux.
We're now joined by Daniel Boardman, who's a senior correspondent for the National Telegraph. He joins us live from Toronto, Canada. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us, as always. Daniel, President Trump has spoken about working with European powers to pressure Russia. He said that Russia faces the same pressure that it did from the previous administration, sanctions, etc. However, we also, of course, saw that meeting in Alaska where it seemed to be all smiles and no deal was reached. How united are the US and Europe right now on Ukraine?
Partially, at best. I mean, they're both on the side of Ukraine, but I mean, Europe, the European Union and the Trump administration have come into instant conflict from the second Trump came in, and he totally reshaped the narrative of Ukraine. And I mean, he quite infamously cut Europe completely out of the peace talks with Russia. So it's a very interesting situation coming in. But he has been getting his way to a certain extent with NATO and the Europeans, and getting everyone to 5% funding. And listen, the problem with the Europeans is not what they say; it's what they do on Russia. So yes, it is important to European security for Ukraine to defend European territory from a hostile Russian advance. That is true, and you should support Ukraine. But the sort of, half-measured support, the restrictions on it is you can't fire weapons from Ukraine into Russia or this or that, and all the sort of holdups. At the same time, I mean, this is the reliance on the Nord Stream 2, the whole pipeline from Russia to be reliant on Russian oil instead of your own industrial capacity, right? The Europeans essentially allowed this conflict to happen because they were reliant on Russian energy, and the Russians felt emboldened to take offensive action. So if Europe sort of wants into the peace talks, they have to start to sort of affect the battlefield and the actual. If they want to be part of the peace, they have to affect the war. And their sort of half-measured support, I think, is sort of getting exposed and is running to conflict with the Trump administration, which is always trying to do something new. And we're hearing different rhetoric, and okay, the Crimea is off the table, and Zelensky can end the war anytime he wants. Which, yeah, Zelensky can end the war anytime he wants. Ukraine, if they just surrender and accept Russian occupation and Russian rule and dominance and retribution, then yeah, they could end the war and just lose and suffer because of that. But they choose not to, which is why the war is being fought in the first place, because the Ukraine doesn't agree with being invaded and occupied. So that's why there's a war. So yes, they could give up. That is one thing that could happen. Putin could also end the war by stopping the war too. I mean, but there's incentives to keep the war going on both sides, and we're not talking about sort of disincentivizing. And this is where the Europeans are right. You should disincentivize the Russians from continuing to the war if you want to pressure the end of the war, not the Ukrainians from fighting, because you're not. I mean, the Ukrainians are already on sort of death ground politically because they're being invaded. So.
Yes, Daniel, obviously we haven't heard directly from the US president or the Russian president himself. However, Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, has said that they have ruled out NATO membership. However, what they are pitching is an Article 5 style protection, security arrangement for Ukraine, which Russia apparently has agreed to. How unprecedented is that?
That's extremely unprecedented, and in some ways maybe not unprecedented. I mean, there were security guarantees from the United States outside of NATO in some strong, very strong, ironclad way for them giving up nuclear weapons, after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, all of this was done, the invasion of Crimea and then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was done under technical American security guarantees that were ironclad. So now, if it could be unprecedented, if this is actually like sort of assigned, if it's like an if it's a legit like peace deal, okay, does the line freeze? Do the Ukrainians have to give up actual territory and like the provinces? But if they give up certain territory, these lines will have like U.S. military backing, and in Article 5, like it's a war of the United States. The United States will then take back all Ukraine, and this would guarantee a full-on stop to the war. That might be a solution that people could supposedly. I mean, that would be up to Ukraine to accept that, but we haven't had any sort of hard proposal, right? So it's a nice thing to say that yes, Ukraine would settle for Article if it was real. If the United States could actually promise, and the Ukrainians could accept that promise and trust that promise of Articles 5 like security guarantees from the United States, then that's one of their conditions for win conditions for Ukraine, right? The continued existence of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians would definitely be accepting to that. But the Russians also know the Ukrainians are accepting to that. So I'm skeptical of what Donald Trump thinks Vladimir Putin agreed to, because I don't trust the Russians to stick to any sort of guarantee. And we're at best 48 hours away out of a recent summit that I would give time for the narrative in the Trump administration to shift wildly in the next week or two.
Yes, Daniel, do stay with us. We have a related update coming up. Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski has said that pressure must be placed on the aggressor and not the victim. The Polish Foreign Ministry spokesperson added that a ceasefire is essential before peace talks can begin. Meanwhile, Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala has stressed that clear security guarantees from the United States and Europe are crucial for further negotiations. Fiala also emphasized that ending the killing is the immediate priority, a point agreed upon by European leaders. In addition, EU's Antonio Costa welcomed the US's willingness to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. He said that if no ceasefire is reached, the EU and US must increase pressure on Russia. Costa underlined the importance of transatlantic unity to achieve lasting peace. The EU Commission spokesperson also confirmed that all leaders reaffirmed their united support for Ukraine's sovereignty and its right to decide on peace terms. The coalition of allies also committed to maintaining full sanctions pressure on Russia until peace is secured. The Coalition of the Willing meeting has now concluded. We're now once again joined by Daniel Boardman. Daniel, we've seen Trump kind of go in this Russian direction in saying that a peace deal needs to be agreed upon and not a ceasefire, meaning terms need to be agreed upon to finalize this war. What are your thoughts in Donald Trump abandoning the idea of a possible temporary pause while negotiations move forward and a haste to agree on territorial concessions and other subjects to peace? Why is this an important part, and who does that favor going into these discussions?
Well, it is definitely I think, a more mature and realistic way of solving the war. I mean, the concept of a ceasefire was always a little bit ridiculous, right? The thought is just, we'll all ceasefire and then, we'll all figure it out kind of from there. That's not generally how ceasefires happen or what they lead to. So if you're talking about solving a conflict, then we should actually talk about going to a peace deal and actually solving the conflict here and there. So that would really depend on the leverage that each side holds, and then what does each side want, right? So it gives Ukrainians some leverage in some ways, and it gives Russians some leverage in the other ways if they're able to negotiate successfully through the American side, and if the Europeans are shut out. So it doesn't really benefit one side over the other, but I think it rather refocuses the terms in which the international community is looking at the war, and I think it's a more realistic and mature way to try and solve this, because there were other conflicts that Trump, I think, has sort of gotten a bit full of himself, where he was able to just sort of yell peace and then it happened. But you saw, he did that India-Pakistan, and that does not seem like a permanent solution to what Operation Sindoor and terrorism was really about. And then he did it sort of the 12-day war right after, Israel to sort of, he had the leverage with Israel because the U.S. was sort of involved actively in that war to sort of yell stop and make it stop. Although you still see Iran and Israel still going out in the shadows, which they have been doing for years. You can't really just yell stop and have the sort of war of Russia and Ukraine stop. It's not the same thing. The U.S. isn't, kinetically involved. There's no U.S. troops actively fighting. These are Ukrainians and Russians fighting in like an active border war. This isn't an Israel-Iran war where the countries aren't even touching, or India-Pakistan where, the U.S. has leverage on both sides. So you can't just yell ceasefire. You can't just yell peace. You can't just demand peace happen. If this is going to be solved, the American State Department and the Trump administration is going to actually have to sit down and hammer this thing out and do an actionable peacetime solution that can make both sides agree to terms in which they can stop. And is that impossible? No. But you can't just fly to Alaska for 2 days, have a chat with Vladimir Putin, yell peace, and then solve the Russia and Ukraine war because you're better than Barack Obama. That's not how anything works.
Daniel, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. Always a pleasure to talk to you. We now move on to a related development and move to the east of Ukraine, where Russia has struck a residential area in Kharkiv with a ballistic missile, and according to reports, it killed a 2-year-old boy and injured at least 15 people late last night, as the US president presses Kyiv to accept a quick peace deal to end the war. Governor Oder Sabov confirmed that among the injured was a 13-year-old girl. He also said that civilian infrastructure in the Sumy region continues to be deliberately targeted treacherously at night by the enemy. Meanwhile, Ukraine's state emergency service told that windows in a nearby apartment buildings were shattered by the blast wave. This obviously comes as US President Donald Trump invites Zelensky to Washington along with other European leaders to discuss peace. We're now joined by Ross Feingold, who is a political analyst. He joins us live from Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, as always, pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to sit with us. Ross, as we've said, this comes at a time when peace is being discussed. Hostilities escalate. Eastern Ukrainian cities continue to be bombarded by Russian drones and missiles. Ross, your thoughts and anticipations going into these peace talks while the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Sumy continue to be the subject of escalating Russian aerial strikes?
Well, we don't know exactly what Trump and Putin discussed behind closed doors, but it appears, and it's probably a safe assumption, that Putin made no commitment to stop targeting civilian infrastructure, even if Russia denies that they do that. Obviously, they do. The death and destruction on the ground is obvious, and it's obvious that civilian targets are being hit by Russian attack. So one of the things to watch coming out of this latest attack on civilian infrastructure is what will President Trump say? When President Trump took office in January, there was an extended period of time afterwards for months while he talked about peace, possibly an initial ceasefire or even a longer-term peace agreement, where he was reluctant to criticize this type of attack by the Russian military on civilian targets in Ukraine. And subsequently, in recent weeks, Trump has periodically been very direct in his criticism, both of President Putin as well as the Russian military, for attacking civilian targets. So again, I think one of the things to watch in the coming hours and days is in the aftermath of the Putin-Trump meeting, and with the possibility of additional in-person meetings, possibly involving President Zelensky of Ukraine as well, is President Trump going to try to be a friend to all sides and not criticize this, or is he going to take to social media in very straight language criticize this attack by Russia?
Yes, indeed, Ross. And what do you think of the dynamic coming into these talks of seeming united European front with Donald Trump in Washington?
We've often talked about that here on NewsX over the past few months, that generally speaking, the Europeans, and specifically the main European military powers, the countries with the ability to provide weapons to Ukraine and possibly to provide troops or air cover in the event of some kind of peace agreement or even a ceasefire, those countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom have largely remained united in their support for Ukraine. What we really don't know, and just simply remains to be seen, is what kind of pressure is President Trump going to put on Zelensky to accept some kind of an agreement, whether that's a ceasefire or now that with all this talk about a more long-term peace agreement. President Trump is very likely to put pressure on Zelensky to accept something that involves Ukrainian territory being occupied open-ended by Russia. And that's going to put those European countries in the middle, because they're going to have to make a decision. And it's a difficult decision, but there's really not too many options. It's either one or the other. Either they're going to take the view of the United States and put pressure on Ukraine to accept that kind of arrangement, or they're going to tell the United States and President Trump, we disagree with you, which means they're going to continue to fund the Ukrainian government and provide weapons to the Ukrainian military. So the decision that those European countries have to make is again, it's a one or the other, but it's certainly a very difficult decision.